Welcome to Backyard Oasis, a podcast designed by and for older adults living in the beautiful Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts and produced in the tech studios at Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Backyard Oasis reaches out to older adults who seek knowledge to help them live more thoughtfully, healthily, and happily, who hope to inspire others with their ideas, and who serve their communities in the interest of the greater good. We hope you join us frequently in our pleasant Backyard Oasis for wide-ranging conversations with a diversity of people who are growing older and want to talk about it.
Good day and welcome to Oasis Podcasts Backyard. I'm Chad and I'm here with Al Rimbach today. Al Rimbach is originally from Nyack, New York area, and he moved to Ashfield in 1968 and had two garages in Greenfield from 74th through 1980. Since then, his garage has been in Ashfield, and he's been running the same business, pretty much repair and sales. We'll probably get into some of that later in the show, but we're going to try to cover cars through the ages. That's what we're naming today's show. We're going to start at the very beginning, and hopefully, if we have time, we'll go on through today and maybe what's in store for the future. So welcome to the show, Al. Good to see you.
Hey, thank you very much.
Why don't we do, like I say, start at the beginning? I know one of them was Duryea. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Right here. As I can tell, yeah.
Yeah, right here in Springfield. Springfield was quite the industrial city back then. Indian Motorcycle and others started here. But what can you tell me about Duryea? Do you know about them?
Very little. It was one of the first cars made. There was others in Europe about the same time. And it was actually a couple of brothers. And I don't think they ever made very many cars, because back then there were people who only made two, and others made 300, so it was an interesting time. As to what else I can tell you about it, I'll bet you it was a one-cylinder, and I bet you that was sitting on top of it. That's the usual way.
Like a prototype.
And they steered them with a tiller a lot rather than a steering wheel. And if you saw what they used for steering linkage.
Do you think, well, they were going pretty slow, too.
Well, they were pretty slow, all right, but they were still more dangerous. They're more dangerous at 12 miles an hour than our cars that are at 100, and that's the truth.
Do you think their prototypes, like you say, there wasn't a big production, but do you think their prototypes were before Mercedes, the currently oldest car company in the world?
I missed some of them, sorry.
Do you think they predated Mercedes, which is the oldest car?
I can't recall. But everybody was onto it. The gasoline engine had been invented, and everybody wanted to stick it into something you could move around instead of a steam engine like a train. So it was, they were already thinking about airplanes at that point, too. The gasoline engine was light enough to consider using for things you couldn't. But, yeah, it was popping up everywhere.
Well, in Europe as well as here.
Was that?
In Europe as well as here. They were popping up all over, you said.
Well, it's a lot of, in the history of science and whatnot, things are not invented in a vacuum. Everybody was working on airplanes when the Wright brothers happened to get the first one that worked, but not for long. And the same with cars. It was an idea whose time had come.
Yeah, right. I really have a big feeling that the more and more discovery of oil and gas, meaning...
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. It made it possible to produce a gasoline engine instead of a steam engine, which is very bulky. And that's how it got exciting. Yeah.
Which reminds me of the Stanley Steamer. Now, today we have alternate fuels, hydrogen cells, batteries, etc. You ever hear of a vehicle running on coal or wood?
I haven't, but I mean, that's what trains ran on. It's bulky, heavy.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. As soon as they could burn something like kerosene or gasoline, it was much more compact. Yeah.
All right, so we got Duryea, or is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, that's right. It's a French word.
In 1880, 1890, something like that.
Something like that.
Then we come up to the 20th century. We got a lot of, I would call them horse cart, makers and bicycle makers switching from horse carts, I guess we could call it, and bicycles, now trying out the gasoline engine, I should say, so we don't confuse it with LP gas, which, like I said, alternative fuels, there have been cars that have run on LP gas. Funny enough, just as a car guy, thumbing through the internet, I found a company with my last name, Fuller.
That's not too surprising.
Yeah, and they were wagon makers out in the Midwest that switched over to cars. Now, these things were, oh my God, like 20 feet long with big, huge wheels that, were almost chest high.
Well,
what can you tell me about some of the cars of that era, the early 1900s?
well, they weren't mostly big like that. They were mostly small four-wheel things that were all open. You read, if you're lucky, you had a windshield. And, they just had a gas motor. It was usually under the seat, in the back, because everything was high, just like a stagecoach, and the roads needed it. So there'd be a little one-cylinder motor under the back seat somewhere.
Oh, one cylinder, okay.
Oh, at most. And it was plenty of power for what they were going to do next.
Did they have that crank in the front instead of a
crank was
starter?
wherever was handy. I don't think it was in the front end because the motor would be nearer the motor. Yeah,
Side, could be at the side.
could be
maybe.
on the side.
Crank it and jump in.
Right. Park it on a hill. It's a lot easier.
All right, so some had the windshield, a rag top, just like you would on a coach. Those early ones.
They didn't know how I need hot top at all. That's
Some without.
yeah.
Those first ones didn't seem overbuilt, really. They were spindly. They were spindly little things.
Oh yeah,
But we're talking again, 19 single digits, 1901, et cetera, et cetera. Up until when was the Ford Model T? Do you know?
About 1908 or something.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there were a lot of cars before that were all cast iron and steel and wood and everything. And they were expensive. They were called toys for the rich.
Uh-huh.
And which they would cost more in a house. But Ford had an idea that maybe, he was from a farm and had the idea it could be useful to make a useful car that people could afford. And the T was actually a very advanced car for its day. It used fancy steel for the chassis instead of cast iron to save weight. Everything he did was to save weight. Anywhere you save weight,
Smart.
you can save more weight.
Yeah.
And he had already been in building cars since like 1900. I think he worked for Cadillac in the beginning. And he's the one, he did not invent the assembly line. It's much older, but for cars, he was the first one. Otherwise, they were building them like they build a coach, a bunch of guys in a room, And,
the huddle. The huddle.
Yeah.
You're in my way. I'm in your way. You're in my way.
Anyway, he was up for efficiency over time. He bought his own steel mills and his own glass making for glass.
Holy cow.
And he understood. It's called a horizontal monopoly where you buy all the things. In fact, The Dodge brothers built all his motors up until the 20s. They were well known and built a good motor. And he finally bought that part out. And it's kind of a good story. He didn't have enough money to pay them the amount. So he went around to all the people who sold Fords, which were like blacksmith shops. And he said, okay, you're going to buy some inventory or you're going to lose your dealership. And Ford was already the most popular brand. Huh. And so they put up all the money for him to buy the Dodge brothers out to start making his own motors. He was good. He was good at thinking like that. Yes.
I saw him copying each other pretty late. Also,
that?
I saw them copying each other pretty late. Also, like you could put the same wheels on Dodge and Ford.
Oh no, that's much later.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I saw the similarities much later.
Yeah. Well, the idea of standardization is a heck of one, but most of the cars were proprietary. That is, they bought a motor from a motor company and a transmission from a transmission company and brakes from a brake company.
Body by Fisher.
Body by Fisher, exactly, which had made carriages before they made cars. Yeah. And
all right, so Ford came up with that assembly line for the car in teens, 20s? When was that, do you think?
It'd be about 1908. The Model T was...
Oh, that early.
Well, that's what his whole idea was.
The whole Model T run, okay.
The Model T was to make a car unbelievably cheap compared with everybody else's. And it went down in price till like 1927 because he kept improving the efficiency.
Yeah.
By 1927, you could buy a Model T for $275. And that was more money than it is now, but it wasn't much. And he kept it as simple to fix as possible. The repair shops, then were all blacksmith shops anyway. But, yeah, he definitely had it in mind that it would be something everybody might use instead of just somebody who was wealthy enough. The cars took over and tractors took over immediately because they were much cheaper than keeping horses. Mm-hmm. Horses are unbelievable. And you're feeding them even if you're not using them.
Yeah.
So that happened quick, and it cleaned up the streets, which were full of horse manure.
Wasn't that something? One of the biggest reasons to switch to the car was the manure problem in the cities.
Oh, they were cleaning it. They had to clean it continuously. Tons and tons of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. One more thing about Ford I understand is his liberal management techniques were not benign. In other words, he upped his workers' salary so they could afford to buy the cars they made.
That was what he said. What happened was that the daily rate was $2.50, and he raised it to $5.
Whoa.
And the other manufacturers hated him. And when asked why, I said, well, I want my workers to be able to afford to buy one of my cars. Actually, as usual, that was a little bit of bullshit. The real reason he did it was if you pay $5 instead of $2.50, you get to pick. Everybody comes to you for a job. And a good employee is always worth way more than twice as much as a regular one.
Okay.
So now he never did anything that wasn't practical. But he did, well, as far as benign goes, he wasn't any worse than any of them. I mean, it was a different time. He provided the housing a lot, for instance. And but that wasn't uncommon back then for a lot of businesses. More feudalistic in some ways.
A bunch of parts were wood, and he grew his own oak there in Michigan for frame parts or whatever it needed to be.
Frames were actually very fancy steel. There wasn't any wood in them, but the body was. He actually went mostly steel because it turned out to be lighter and easier to fabricate, and their frames were the highest, fanciest steel that was available at the time. Everybody else was using cast iron, which is heavy, and he knew saving weight would make everything more efficient. And he was a character for sure.
Okay, we out of the teens yet with the when the Model A came in? Model
A came in 27 or 8.
Okay.
It was he hadn't changed it at all, and it was lagging behind everybody else's stuff. Nevertheless, they sold 60% of all the cars in the country.
Well, so he changed from the T to the A to compete with the other companies.
Well, it's time to modernize it in a lot of ways. Whether it was, he was already selling all the cars, 60%. But I mean, things had changed a lot since 1908, but 1920 was a big period, and his hadn't. And so they came up with a much more modern car.
How fast could the A go?
What years?
No, how fast could the A go?
Oh, how fast did an A go? Well, 40 was pretty, it might go faster depending, but it wasn't.
Speeding.
It was on the
So
roads
a cruise at 35?
On the roads they had, you didn't really want to go too fast.
Yeah,
that way.
okay.
But no, my father talked about being down in Florida, and if you were going into the headwinds at 45, it started to overheat, because it wasn't. Anyway,
And the
the
gas
technology of the day, the water wasn't doing enough work, so.
The gas tank was on your lap?
The gas tank was on the, right under the windshield.
Oh, great.
Right behind the motor. You filled it, and it gravity fed to the carburetor, no fuel pump. And he wasn't the only one to do that. That was more or less standard.
Kiss it goodbye in an accident, huh?
Accident? Well, being in one of those cars was an accident. I mean,
I tried to fit into a Model A once. I'm trying to remember if it had a suicide door or not, but as I slid my foot in between the door, the frame, the door, and the platform that the seat was mounted on, I could not get my foot in unless I turned it pointed ways or heel first.
Yeah.
You couldn't sweep it in like you do, in a modern car. It was that tight.
yes, they were not big. But gets you where you're going. Now, a main reason. So.
And then during the Depression, a doodle bug, there's still some around, was one of these Model A's that was turned into a tractor. Amazing. The ingenuity
They were already
of the
making
farmers.
tractors for years by then. They had steam tractors.
Well,
first.
I'm saying a guy who
Oh,
is in
yeah.
the Depression and he doesn't have any money and he wants to scratch and claw at the ground and grow some food to survive.
Sure.
They turned some of those cars into
Well,
what
they
out in
turned-
the Midwest they call the doodle bug, which is a tractor made out of a.
Model
geez.
T's too. They made them out of. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and
make
skidoo
it-
type
huh?
things.
What's that?
Skidoo type things with snow skis on the front and rear tires with nails through the tire for traction.
Whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sleigh. It's a sleigh.
It was, it was a time when people thought for themselves and did what they could. Now we're all intimidated and do what we're told. And
What do you think the horsepower in a Model A was?
actually, I'm supposed to know the answer to that.
35?
Something like that, 35 or
35
40.
horsepower,
Yeah.
yeah.
40. I think it was 40.
40,
Yeah.
okay.
It was higher than the T, which was like 25 or something. But again, given the nature of the vehicles,
So we're into the 20s and 30s. When do you think hydraulic brakes? These old brakes were chains, cable, and a
Rods.
shoe.
They were rods.
that pulled and pushed. When do you think hydraulic
well, what
brakes
happened was
started
in the
coming out?
20s, Ford was resistant to making hydraulics was considered kind of like NASA, was high tech, and he wanted. People didn't necessarily understand how to fix it or anything, so he kept them mechanical right up till 1939.
Okay.
Everybody else went over to hydraulics in the 20s, which worked infinitely better. It's not even worth discussing. My father would tell me, you'd go in to get your oil changed or whatever, and they'd adjust your mechanical brakes, which was the length of the rods. And it stopped straight for another few days, and then it started pulling one way.
Uh-oh.
You couldn't possibly keep them in balance. Hydraulic automatically balances the pressure to all the brakes, so it's a heck of a good idea.
So we're in the 30s. What about cars of the 40s? Let's take typical, okay, the industry has post-World War II and pre-war cars and post-war cars. Maybe
which were basically the same.
We should finish up maybe the pre-war cars.
Yeah.
Well, when I look at cars of the era, I really have a visceral difference. I really like from late 30s, definitely after 35, 6, 7, 8. They begin to be more smooth, how could I say it, almost a feminine shape. That's
ugly,
really, really in my mind. It's taste. Yeah. How can we account for taste? In Europe, it's the 50s, 60s, and kind of ends in the 70s for what I like to look at, those rounded lines. What can you say? You said that pre- and post-war cars aren't that different?
Well, no, what I'm saying is the cars they were making in 1941 or 39, then there was the war to take care of. When they came out again in 46, they were the same cars.
Okay.
And they rapidly changed after that. But if you compare the model, it would probably be the same models. They didn't have time to redesign it. They were too busy.
Yeah, just pre- and post-war.
And there was a shortage of cars. They wanted to get them going, So it was like that. To that extent, they were the same. And then they changed very, very rapidly. The big change was the gasoline was very low octane before the war. And I don't know if even it was 80, 70. The compression ratios were like 5 or 6 to 1 at most. Right. And after the war, they developed much higher octane gasoline for fighter planes.
Exactly.
And so immediately, you could go to 8 to 1, and that's as high as you can get on a flathead because of the space of the combustion chamber. And that's when overhead valves came back strong, because it went 9 to 1, 10 to 1, 11 to 1, as you could get gas that was very didn't knock, would put up with the compression. You get a lot more power and efficiency the higher your compression, which is the main reason a diesel at 18 to 1 gets better efficiency than a gas engine. It's got to do with compression.
So now you're talking maybe 50s. I call that the bulge mobile.
Right. Well, the early 50s.
They were really rounded, not that
you got
feminine
early 50s
shape.
and mid 50s, late 50s.
Yeah.
You went from cars that still looked like the 30s and 40s to cars that looked like the Batmobile on steroids.
Yes.
And, by the way, it was some of the worst junk ever made.
The early 60s, you're saying?
Just awful.
Yeah.
They were improving them so fast they didn't know how to make them. They had automatic transmissions, which they didn't know how to make. They had hydraulic lifters. Everything they did was, and they didn't care because people were buying like crazy. Mm-hmm. So they actually...
The economy was booming.
Yeah, right. And they actually... Well, if your car was 2 or 3 years old, you couldn't buy parts for it anymore, like body parts and stuff.
Huh.
And it was a game the manufacturers were playing. And to get you to buy a new one, otherwise you couldn't fix it. So the federal government stepped in and said, no, you have to keep parts for 10 years for anything you build.
Right.
And it still is 10 years, only now the equivalent would be 25 or 30. Now, lots of Japanese cars and stuff keep them around for 25 or 30. Mm-hmm. Other companies, as when the last one is built, the clock runs out in 10 years of that model. And,
I got a 78 motorcycle, Japanese motorcycle. I can still get parts
well,
for
I dare
brand
say.
new. Yeah.
Yeah. No, they have
it's amazing.
They think differently, like some ethics. Well, they had to come from nowhere. Made in Japan was a joke. It meant toy. You couldn't have said anything worse than made in Japan. And to make a car, and so they had to do it the hard way. They had to earn it. Yeah, okay.
Let's stay American. Just we're wrapping up.
Well, we made all
shortly.
the cars, and the only affordable ones, really.
Something you said a little earlier, it made me think might help with the development of the muscle cars that they had in the mid and late 60s. You said they were kind of junky in the early 60s.
No, the late 50s, they were the worst.
Oh, okay.
By the beginning of the 60s, they were getting much better, yeah.
Yeah, the finned monsters.
The fins, well, they were.
I remember the
they
displacement.
just the technology wasn't. technology improved big, and the cars from the '60s are some of the first good cars ever built in terms of practical own, and cheap.
The displacement started to swell up. I remember the Thunderbolt. What was the Fury or whatever that was? These were square-lined cars of the early '60s
Right.
that had, I call it the pre-muscle. They had big motors.
Well, they
I
had the
think
big-
the Beach Boys sing a song
They kept
about
getting bigger.
409 and stuff like that.
But you got to remember, in the '50s, they had the 392 Hemi, which wasn't tiny, and they had the Rocket 88, which is up to 391 or something. So the motors were already big, but they were getting. Well, the muscle car was they took a big motor from a big car and shoved it in a smaller car,
Right.
which made it fast,
105-inch
bad
wheelbase.
handling because it was too nose heavy, and a hell of an idea,
Yeah. Truck motor in a
Well, it wasn't a truck motor; it was
medium-sized
like
car.
a Cadillac motor stuffed into a small
Yeah.
four-door sedan, and it went, but they had no traction because the motor was too heavy. But they certainly jumped.
Good in a straight line, yeah.
Yep.
Drag
Straight
car.
line machine, exactly.
So we got through the late '60s. Let's see, the '70s really sort of kept it.
The '70s were a big problem because there was emissions controls that was being changed every few years. So
That's right.
the fools built cars that passed the emissions, and then 2 years later they had to come up with a new idea. VW, on the other hand, started using fuel injection
yeah.
in 1968.
Yeah.
They figured, we'll do something that can be made to run cleaner. And the interesting sideline is, who invented fuel injection, electronic or electrical? Well, Bendix, an American
Really?
company. In the 50s, they had put it in a couple Chevys and a couple Dodges.
You had a Corvette.
And Bosch bought the rights and started putting them in VWs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we got that era changing into electronic ignitions, which was
That was
kinda
turned out to
new
be a
then.
good thing.
The what is it? ECU that became the
That's a computer.
computer of
that
later
was,
years.
Yeah, computers. Every car had a computer from 1981 on, even though a lot of them were carbureted. And then the computer was good for making fuel injection because it could figure everything out fairly well. So fuel injected cars are so much better than carbureted cars. You don't even want to discuss it.
Yeah, going from oceanside to mountaintop and things like
Well,
that.
it's not like that. I mean, there were some years when you could buy a certain car that came, the cheaper model was a carburetor, and the next one up was fuel injection.
Yeah.
You would think they almost doubled the size of the motor, but they hadn't. It was the same motor.
Right, electronic
It's just that the
ignition,
fuel
yeah.
injection could give it the right
fuel
amount of gas
injection.
all the time.
Okay.
A carburetor was a horrible compromise, but there was nothing else,
The Venturi.
But the funny thing is now you get some people who tell us how cars were much faster when they had carburetors, just like, and biplanes used to fly to the moon. It's like total. Anybody who lived through the age of carburetors is very glad they're gone. That's for sure.
I stopped playing with cars in the late '70s because I graduated from school and had a nice income and I could pay a mechanic.
Oh yeah, there you go.
But because of that, I missed the electronic fuel injection and the computers. So
Well, you didn't miss
we
them.
jumped.
Exactly.
We jumped
Yes.
to, let's say, '85, and we have throttle body, a dual jet fuel injection into a carburetor almost. And it sort of evolves. Would you say by early or mid '90s, they're
Yeah, by
pretty
the
much
beginning
where
of
we're
the
at today?
90s, around there, everybody pretty much had multi-point fuel injection, which is one injector for every cylinder. But even then, there's a series of evolutions beyond that.
Sequential port.
But that was sort of, that's the basic. And they were infinitely more reliable. Anybody who thinks fuel injection is a problem knows nothing. It's always been more reliable than any other form of getting a car to run, always.
Okay, how about, we're not exactly up to today, but How about these vehicles now that have the big screen, a big computer screen on the dashboard?
That would be illegal if we still had regulations because it's extremely dangerous. You spend more time looking at it to adjust things than you would the old-fashioned method were. And there's no question that they would have had to take them out almost immediately. The lawsuits would have been unbelievable. There's no way they could have got away with it, but we're being deregulated, so don't drop your soap, as they say.
Give them what they want. Sell them more bells and whistles.
The marketers think it's great, but they're finding out that humans, by the mid-2000s, don't like all the stuff. It's too much and it's too complicated.
Excellent.
And it's like they find a way through it like a rat through a maze, and they don't learn the rest. And the fact is, if somebody had a model with old-fashioned, a simplified system, they'd sell them because it's a pain in the ass, and they're much more prone to trouble. You have to outthink the computer. It's not really helping you. And it's devised by marketeers and computer guys who think they're making a computer game, so save the princess, drive off the road.
How about all the accessories they have now?
What's that?
How about all the accessories they have now?
All the accessories. Well, I'm thinking mostly of gizmos like that. Recently, Tesla put in a braking system that'll stop your car if they think you're too close to the car ahead of you.
Autonomous.
It's wrecked a lot of Teslas so far because it decides when you might have to stop and locks up the brakes. They got pictures of them.
Oh, boy.
And there's another thing I almost hate to mention called lane assist.
I've heard of that.
That's caused a lot of accidents, too. And you can't turn it off. I wouldn't mind if you wanted, but once you got that automatic braking, Musk is in big trouble on them. He's got lawsuits.
Really,
he'll survive.
Musk, yeah.
He's smart, but
All right.
automatic isn't always better.
To wrap up, you got any predictions about the cars of 2030, 2040?
Well, they're all going to be electric. The whole gas engine. General Motors has said they will not build any combustion engines in 2035. And they're going to come in quicker. The only reason they seem more expensive now is the cost of the battery. Electric car is much cheaper to build than a gas engine car. The electric motor has one moving part, remember. But the batteries have been coming down very rapidly.
Yeah,
That's the key.
I put one in for $300 a couple months ago.
A new battery.
$300.
For what car was that?
The Purus, however you pronounce it.
No kidding.
And it was all modular. You snap this off, snap the other thing off, push it right in there.
They're very
plug
easy
it
to
in,
change. All of them are easy to change.
throw the switch, put back the
Well,
cover.
what happened was a few years ago, a Prius battery was $5,000.
Yeah.
Which meant it lasted a long time, but that pretty much wiped out any gas you thought you saved. And then one year, the Chinese came out with a replacement for $500. So you could, and this had been predicted more or less, but that's a big change. So that meant a new battery or something might cost less than a brake job. So it was no longer a limiting factor in terms of the actual cost of ownership, and that's where we're headed.
So you think it'll be the battery, not the hydrogen cell? Hard to say, or?
I despise hydrogen. You can't carry enough to get out of your own way. You can't condense it down to a liquid.
Okay.
I don't know why anybody's interested in it, but
Heidelberg.
electricity works just fine. Electric motor puts 90% of the power onto the road. A hydrogen motor isn't going to work any better on a gasoline engine as far as that goes. Only just, I'm not with it.
All right. I don't think we could go too much further. I want to thank you for coming in today, and wish you luck in Rimbach's auto sale. You want to drop a net address or a phone number or anything?
It's RimbachAuto@gmail.
And do you use
Just all little letters, one word, Rimbach, RIMBACH, auto@gmail. And that's my personal one, but there's also, you can look up RimbachAuto.com.
Okay.
And I have a web page.
So how about a phone number?
I beg your pardon?
How about a phone number?
413-628-4795.
And it's out on Creamery Road in
On
Ashfield.
Creamery Road in Ashfield. And I live there, so you can call pretty much any time. I may not be there, but it could be.
All right. Thanks for all your information and time, Mr. Rimbach.
Thank you.
Take care.
This concludes today's podcast. We're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to reach out to Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College, at 413-775-1819 if you have an idea you'd love to share. Special thanks to the creators of Backyard Oasis, Denise Schwartz, Chad Fuller, Dennis Lee, and Christine Copeland. Have a great day.